Trump thought Canada was vulnerable. He thought a trade fight, a tense USMCA review, and a minority government in Ottawa would push Mark Carney into a weaker position. He thought pressure from Washington was arriving at the perfect moment. But that is not what happened. Because while the White House hardened its tone, while uncertainty kept growing, and while the political clock kept moving, Carney did not come out more isolated. He came out stronger. And that is the part that makes this story so uncomfortable for Trump. What looked like an opportunity to corner Canada may have ended up producing the exact opposite. A Canadian government that is more solid, freer to move, and much harder to pressure. That is the real turn in this story. We are not just talking about a trade dispute. We are not just talking about tariffs or a technical review of North America's most important agreement. We are talking about how a pressure strategy may have altered Canada's internal political balance in a way Washington probably did not want to see. Because when Trump raised the pressure, Mark Carney was still governing without an absolute majority. He still looked exposed. He still looked forced to survive with limited room to maneuver. And in theory, that should have been the ideal scenario for Washington. A minority leader is, on the surface, easier to contain, easier to wear down, easier to force into reacting, with less room to make broad decisions, with less ability to turn a crisis into a political project. That seemed to be the logic, and on paper it made sense. The United States remains the dominant force in North America. It remains the economic center of the region. It remains the largest market. And Canada remains deeply dependent on its relationship with Washington. On top of that, the USMCA review had already entered a more uncertain phase. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said on April 7th that the talks would likely extend beyond July 1, 2026, that contacts with Canada would begin in May, and that Washington remains deeply dissatisfied with parts of the agreement, especially over cars, steel, and aluminum. From Washington, all of that could be read as a favorable combination. A smaller neighbor, a prime minister without a majority, a trade agreement entering a zone of tension, and a White House determined to keep the pressure on. But this is where the story begins to turn, because pressure strategies have a problem that often only becomes visible when it is already too late. They work very well in the abstract. They work very well on the theoretical board. They work very well inside strategy rooms where everything seems to respond to the arithmetic of power. But real politics does not always respond that way. Because when a country begins to feel that outside pressure is threatening not only its economic interests, but also its political room to maneuver, its stability, and even its sense of control, what happens is not always fragmentation. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the center hardens. Sometimes fear from the outside makes conflict on the inside more costly. Sometimes the pressure that was supposed to expose weakness ends up producing cohesion. And that may be exactly what started happening in Canada. Because what looked like a phase of attrition turned, almost without warning, into a phase of power concentration. Mark Carney is no longer standing in the same place he was when this phase of the clash with Trump began. Canadian politics moved, Parliament moved, and the image of his government moved too. Suddenly, the question stopped being whether Carney would survive the blow. The question became something else. What if the blow is helping him consolidate? That is the true starting point of this story, not a technical discussion about trade, not another routine episode between Washington and Ottawa, not just one more exchange of threats and calculated responses, but a much more serious question. What happens when a great power tries to use pressure to set the terms and ends up pushing the other country's leader closer to a position of greater control? Because if that is what is happening, then this was not just an aggressive move, it was a badly calibrated move. A move that looked logical from the standpoint of force, a move that looked clean on paper, a move that assumed Canada would react like the smaller, dependent, and ultimately constrained partner. But politics does not always obey the simplest logic of power. And when that logic fails, the outcome can be much more dangerous than an uncomfortable negotiation. It can change the political center of a country. And if that has already started happening in Canada, then the real problem for Trump is not only that Ottawa is resisting, it is that the pressure may have set something much bigger in motion. It may have begun to create the exact kind of Canadian government Washington least wanted to face. And the proof that the story has moved is not in a theory. It is in the numbers. Because in a matter of days, Mark Carney went from governing under pressure to governing with a majority. The Liberals secured control of Parliament with 174 of the 343 seats, enough to govern without relying on support from other parties. And Reuters noted that this gives Carney a much stronger position against the trade war launched by Trump, as well as a clear path to govern until 2029. That is not a minor improvement. It changes the entire nature of the government. Because one thing is to survive, and something very different is to control. A government that survives is still reacting. It still counts every vote. It still feels the weight of every negotiation. It still moves knowing that any major step could collide with parliamentary fragility. But a government with a majority enters another category. It no longer governs with the same anxiety. It no longer negotiates from the same narrow position. It no longer faces every crisis with the feeling that any mistake could block it from within. And that difference matters enormously when the country is entering a harsher phase with its main trading partner. That is why the change is not only arithmetic, it is psychological, it is institutional, it is strategic. Suddenly, the leader who looked exposed no longer looks so exposed. The prime minister who looked constrained no longer looks provisional. And the government that looked vulnerable begins projecting something else: continuity, authority, room to maneuver. That is exactly what turns this story into a reversal of power. Because Trump was not pressuring a leader who already controlled the entire board. He was pressuring a leader who, on the surface, still seemed to have too little space to absorb a long shock. And yet the visible result was not an erosion of Carney, it was an expansion of Carney. Now the problem for Washington is no longer only that Carney is still there. The problem is that he is no longer there under the same conditions. Because from this point on, the White House is no longer dealing with a prime minister forced to survive vote by vote. It is dealing with a prime minister who has more freedom to turn outside tension into an internal political project. And that is an enormous difference. Because a leader with a majority can do something that a minority leader rarely does well: think in long phases. He can treat this fight not only as a temporary storm, but as a sign that something deeper has changed in the relationship with the United States. He can govern as if this phase were not an isolated episode, but the beginning of a new continental logic. That is the real leap. The majority does not only protect Carney, the majority gives him permission to legislate faster, permission to impose priorities, permission to build a long-term narrative, permission to tell the country that the threat from outside requires a more coherent response at home. And if Trump's pressure helped produce that result, then the story can no longer be told as a simple show of American strength. It has to be told as something more uncomfortable, as a strategy that may have ended up handing Carney the most important political asset of all: real control over the center of the system. That is why this chapter matters so much, because here we are no longer talking about an abstract possibility, we are talking about a fact. Carney is no longer on the verge of consolidating, he has already consolidated. And that means the next phase of this story will no longer be played against a government that merely appears weak. It will be played against a government that is far more stable, far more centralized, and far harder to corner than Trump probably expected. But the majority did not appear on its own. And that is the part where this story becomes even more delicate for Washington. Because we are not just talking about a good parliamentary week for Carney. We are not talking about a political accident. We are not talking about a coincidence. We are talking about movements that started pushing the Canadian political center in a very specific direction. AP reported that Marilyn Gladue, when leaving the Conservatives to join the Liberals, cited Trump's threats to Canada's sovereignty and economy, along with recent tariffs, as part of the reason for switching sides. Even before the majority was secured, Reuters had already pointed out that her move was the fifth defection from the opposition to the Liberals since November. That matters more than it seems, because it means Trump's pressure was not functioning only as a bilateral force. It was not falling only on trade, on markets, or on the USMCA negotiations. It was also moving pieces inside the Canadian political system itself. And when outside pressure begins to reorder the internal politics of the country you wanted to weaken, the strategy stops looking clean. It starts to look like blowback. It starts to look like a form of pressure that is producing not just attrition, but alignment. Because one thing is to raise the cost for the other side. It is something very different to raise the cost of opposing its government from within. That is what seems to have happened here. Under normal conditions, an opposition can exploit the fragility of a minority government. It can present that government as incapable of controlling the situation. It can use the crisis to wear it down even more. It can turn outside pressure into proof of internal weakness. But when the outside threat begins to feel more serious, more persistent, and more structural, that calculation changes. Then some actors start thinking something different. Maybe I do not agree with everything this government is doing, but weakening it now could cost the country even more. That kind of thinking changes parliaments. It changes coalitions. It changes individual decisions. And when it repeats itself, it changes the entire climate of the system. That is what makes this story so dangerous for Trump. Because if Washington's pressure helped turn Carney into the meeting point of a new Canadian political urgency, then the original logic of the strategy has already broken down. Trump wanted Canada to feel more fragile, but he may have helped parts of Canada feel a greater urgency to reinforce the center. Trump wanted Carney to look limited, but he may have handed him the perfect argument to ask for more room, more discipline, and more control. Trump wanted to use parliamentary vulnerability as a crack, but that crack ended up closing. And that is the kind of reversal that does not always arrive in a single explosion. It does not appear in an instant. It is not announced as a great victory. It does not come with triumphant music or a visible ceremony. It accumulates. First a threat, then a sense of national discomfort. After that, small movements inside the system. Then a new reading of leadership, and finally, a majority that no longer looks unlikely, but natural. That is exactly what makes the idea behind this story so valuable. Because here, there really is a genuine turn. It's not just a story about pressure. It's a story about pressure that starts strengthening the very actor who was supposed to come out weakened. And if that happened, then Trump didn't just raise the level of the conflict, he may have helped create the perfect political environment for Carney. An environment in which the Prime Minister stops looking like a provisional administrator and starts looking like the necessary man for a more dangerous stage. That change in perception is worth a great deal. Because in times of uncertainty, systems do not always reward the loudest figure. Very often, they reward the one who seems more functional, more stable, more technical, more capable of enduring a long fight without breaking. And that profile fits Carney much better than Washington probably wanted to admit. That is why this part of the story matters so much. Because this is where the conflict stops being only a clash between capitals and starts becoming a reorganization of legitimacy inside Canada. And when that happens, the White House is no longer managing a simple scenario. It's dealing with the internal political consequences of its own strategy. And that is where the clock enters the story. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum. It is happening while the USMCA is entering a much more dangerous phase of uncertainty. On April 7th, Jamieson Greer said that talks over the agreement would likely stretch beyond July 1, 2026, that contacts with Canada would begin in May, and that Washington remains dissatisfied with different parts of the pact. Reuters also reported that Greer left open the possibility that the United States could consider tougher steps, including the threat of leaving the agreement, in order to keep pressuring the renegotiation. That detail matters much more than it seems, because in economic geopolitics, time is not a technical detail, it is a tool of pressure. When a power leaves floating the possibility of a longer, more uncertain and harsher negotiation, it does not only make markets nervous, it also forces the other country to decide how it wants to organize itself in order to survive the process. And that is where Carney gains something very valuable once again. He gains argument. Because now he can tell Canada something that is very hard to refute. This is not a passing storm. It is not a bad month. It is not temporary noise. It is a longer phase, a more structural phase, a more dangerous phase. And if that is true, then the country needs something very clear, more room to maneuver, not less. It needs a firmer political center, not an executive permanently tied down by parliamentary fragility. It needs more internal coherence, not more dispersion. It needs a government capable of moving quickly when the external environment becomes less reliable. That is the great turn in this story. What Washington presents as outside pressure, Carney can turn into an argument for internal power. What Trump wants to use to tighten Ottawa, Ottawa can use to close ranks. What looked like a tool of attrition can be transformed into a tool of consolidation. And that completely changes the logic of the confrontation. Because if the outside threat starts becoming useful in strengthening the leader you wanted to weaken, then you are no longer controlling the political effects of your own strategy. And that is a very dangerous signal for any White House. Because the goal of coercion is not only to cause damage, it is to produce a favorable outcome. And here, the outcome is beginning to look far less clear. Trump wanted the cost to fall on Canada, but the political benefit may be accumulating around Carney. Trump wanted time to work against Ottawa, but time is allowing the argument for a stronger majority to gain weight. Trump wanted the Canadian government to look constrained, but the longer the horizon of tension stretches, the easier it becomes for Carney to say that the country cannot respond adequately with such a narrow margin. That is not a detail. That is the core of the battle. Because in the end, the question is no longer only what Washington will do with the USMCA. The bigger question is what kind of Canadian government will be standing across from it when this phase reaches its hardest point. A fragile government, forced to survive vote by vote? Or a government that has used this very threat to justify itself as a more stable and more disciplined center? That difference changes everything, not only for Canada, also for the United States. Because a White House can calculate how to pressure a fragile government. What is much more difficult is discovering that the same pressure helped create a stronger one. And that is exactly what this story is beginning to suggest. Not with a single explosion, not with one visible twist, but with something much more unsettling. The sense that Canada's internal board is no longer reacting the way Washington expected. That fear is not breaking the center, it is closing it. That the threat is not fully weakening the leader, it is legitimizing him. That the pressure is not making Carney less relevant, it is making him more necessary.
And if all of that is true, then the next question is no longer whether Carney can survive. The real question is what he can now do with the power that Trump's pressure may have helped consolidate. Because a majority is not just protection, it is permission. Permission to move faster, permission to legislate with less friction, permission to stop governing from a defensive position, permission to turn a phase of threat into a broader political project. And that is already starting to show. Reuters reported that after securing the majority, Carney pledged to focus on the cost of living, the housing crisis, infrastructure, and a more self-reliant Canadian economy. He also announced the temporary suspension of the federal fuel tax from April 20th to September 7th as an immediate relief measure. That matters enormously, because it shows that this is no longer just a government absorbing pressure. It is a government beginning to use the new political space it has. And that is where the story becomes much bigger than a simple clash with Trump. Because if Carney uses this majority to turn uncertainty with Washington into a doctrine of government, then this conflict will no longer be remembered only as a trade fight. It will be remembered as the moment when Canada began to treat its dependence on the United States not only as an economic fact, but as a strategic vulnerability. That is the kind of lesson that changes decades. Not because Canada can replace the U.S. market overnight. It cannot. Not because geography stops mattering. It does not. And not because Ottawa is going to become immune to pressure from Washington. It is not going to become immune. But strategy does not need an immediate exit to matter. It needs direction. And that is exactly what a majority gives Carney, the ability to turn a reaction into a direction. The ability to say that this is not only about resisting Trump's latest move, it is about redesigning how Canada thinks about its exposure, its room to maneuver, and its economic defense for the next phase. That is the true scale of this story. Trump wanted to demonstrate control. He wanted Canada to feel the weight of American leverage. He wanted the asymmetry of size to be politically obvious. He wanted Washington to look like the actor setting the pace, while Ottawa merely adjusted. But if the final result is a Carney government that is stronger, freer, and more capable of turning pressure into internal legitimacy, then the story changes completely. Then the question is no longer whether Trump can still pressure Canada. The answer is yes. The truly important question is another one. Did he just help create the exact kind of Canadian government he least wanted to face? A government with more parliamentary control, more internal legitimacy, more room to absorb short-term damage, and more reasons to treat dependence on Washington as a long-term risk. If that is what we are seeing, then this was not just another trade fight. It was a strategic miscalculation. Because the most dangerous mistake in a pressure strategy is not causing pain, it is producing clarity on the other side. And if Canada is beginning to see more clearly, more coldly, and more urgently how it wants to reorganize itself in relation to the United States, then this confrontation will have left behind much more than headlines. It will have left behind a new political logic. And that would be deeply uncomfortable for Trump. Because then the story would not end by saying that Carney simply resisted. It would end by saying something much harsher, that the attempt to corner him helped create the conditions for him to govern from a much stronger position than before. That is not the kind of victory Washington wanted to hand over, but it may be exactly the one it ended up handing over. Because in the end, the clearest sign that a strategy failed is not only that the rival is still standing, it is that the rival ends up stronger. And if Mark Carney turns this majority into a more disciplined, more coherent governing platform, one more focused on reducing vulnerabilities vis-à-vis Washington, then the lesson of this story will be impossible to ignore. Trump wanted to tighten control, and he may have helped Carney take the entire board.